Welcome to the theory webinar for Portugal. We took last week off. Back rolling, we've got just a couple of more presentations to fill out the entire syllabus, which is really exciting for me. Today, of course, the focus is on Portugal and really the dry wines of Portugal. We've discussed Madeira and Port pretty in depth in the fortified presentation, so I'll leave that to itself. You can check that video out. But today, again, is going to focus on the dry wines of Portugal. You can see the map here from Wine Folly, always a fantastic resource for these things. A couple of things to note: Madeira in the southwest is about 668 miles off the coast, and then the Azores, which we'll talk very briefly about 972 miles due west of Lisbon. We'll talk mainly about the sub-regions, the regions, the wines that work there, soil types, and a couple of producers too. Just to give you a point of reference, the Google Maps shows Lisbon here, and this is the Azores way out in the middle of nowhere, and here's Funchal and Madeira right down here too. History, pre-colonial. There were, of course, periods of occupation by the Phoenicians, the Greeks, the Celts, the Romans. Then you had the Germanic and Moorish in the Common Era that really frustrated viticulture. The Portuguese ejected the Moors and nationalized in 1250, almost a couple of hundred years before Spain did. The Treaty of Windsor with England in 1386 marks the beginning of a long and prosperous friendship. This creates trade between England and Portugal and opens trade routes and really begins the large Navy presence that we see under Prince Henry the Navigator, which explores Madeira and the African coast. Then comes the colonial era, where they colonize and raise Madeira, which Madeira translates to the Isle of Woods. Of course, today there's almost no woods because they lit everything on fire and it burned for like 7 years. But they raised it in 1419 to make the land suitable for viticulture. By 1571, Portugal had a string of bases and outposts all the way to Nagasaki, and one of the largest naval presences in the world. King Philip II of Spain briefly inherited the Portuguese crown in 1580. This caused Portuguese outposts to fall under attack by rivals of Spain, France, England, and the Dutch Republic. Stretched by war, the Portuguese influence began to wane. In 1820, Brazil left the country, leaving only a few African colonies under Portuguese control. In the modern era, you see Antonio Salazar rules an autocratic government from 1932 until he was ousted in 1968. While his human rights abuses abounded, he was a founding member of NATO and the UN. His Estado Novo regime was finally overthrown in the 1974 Carnation Revolutions, an interesting revolution to take a look at, as they pinned carnations on soldiers that were leaving, as well as putting them in their guns. So very peaceful revolution. Portugal joined the EU in 1986, which wrested control of the co-ops and the monopolies and gave power back to the smaller producers. Modern Portuguese wine era was then born in 1986. Before we get too deep into legal stuff, I wanted to give you sort of a glossary of terms. I don't speak Portuguese. I can't imagine too many people that are following these videos are great at it. And if you do, wonderful for you. But for the rest of us, here are a few glossary of terms. Garrafa means bottle. Garrafeira is slang for a wine shop or cellar. It's also an aging term used in different DOP and IGP wines. Engarrafado is bottled either at or in. Dolce is dry and seco is sweet. Adega is a winery or a cellar. Bacatira is marc or grappa. And a casta is a grape variety. Legal terms, broadly, to fall within the EU terms, the DOC or DIPR are DOP, and then IGVR wines are IGP. So for DOP and IGP, they follow 85% EU rules. There's 14 regional IGPs in Portugal, and then there are 31 DOPs or DOCs within those. Wines that do not meet IGP, DOP requirements are labeled simply as Vinho de Mesa or Vinho. If the wine is vintage dated and it's DOP or IGP, they can amend the following terms. Garrafeira, which indicates extra aging. For Tinto, that's 30 months total aging with 12 in bottle. For Branco and Rosado, it's 12 and 6. When you apply it to port, it indicates a minimum of 8 years in glass demijohns after its oak aging, which was pioneered by Newport. Reserva indicates an extra 0.5% of alcohol over the minimum requirements for that particular DOP IGP. And for still wines, that's still wines. And then 12 months on the lees for traditional method wines. And then Colheita Seleccionada indicates an extra full % of alcohol above the DOP IGP minimum. So a few legal terms to clean up there. If you take a look at it and study it a little more in depth, it becomes a bit more clear. As far as the grapes here, or castas, are concerned, for red, Castelao, otherwise known as Periquita, was once the most planted, is recently replaced by Aragonés, which makes meaty, tannic wines with sort of a red fruit core. Touriga Nacional is the finest red Casta in Portugal with about 10% of the total acreage. It's cherished for dry reds, and of course its inclusion in the Porto blend. Synonyms here include Bical Tinto and Mortagua Preto. Handful of other red grapes include Alfraquiro, Trincadera, Baga, very important, we'll get to that, and Aragonés, of course, which is Tinto Roriz, otherwise known as Tempranillo in Spain. For whites, known as Branco in the area, Fernão Pires, which is Maria Gomez in Bairrada, as the most planted white grape. You'll also find Encruzado and Arito from noble whites, and then there's a handful of others, including Alvarinho. So here's another look at the wine folly map, and I tried to break it down to make it a little bit easier to recall into coastal versus inland areas for IGPs, okay? So here on the coast, you'll find MINHO, or Vinho Verde, which of course is named after the Minho River. That is the border between Rias Baixas and Vinho Verde. Beira Atlantico, which you'll find as we get further. I mean, I guess we could consider Dow sort of in between, but I went straight to Beira Atlantico and the Bairrada here. Lisboa here. TEJO, Peninsula de Setúbal, and Algarve, what I would consider the coastal areas. And then inland, you've got Transmontano, the DURIENSE, Terras de Sister right here, Terras de Dow, Terras de Beira, which is where you find Beira Interior. Beira really the one that splits across two. Originally it was one area, now it's been split into Beira Atlantico and Beira Interior. And then Alentejano in the south. You could try to put all 14 of the regions. A buddy of mine came up with this silly saying in order to try and remember it. This was just way too much for me, trying to remember 14 things. So I split it into coastal and inland. And here's another look at it, coastal and inland. MINHO, Beira Atlantico, Lisboa, TEJO, Peninsula, Setúbal, and Algarve, and then inland, Transmontano, DURIENSE, your three terras, Dow, Sister, Beira, and Alentejano. We start in the north with Vinho Verde, or MINHO, and we're going to take a look at the subregions here of Vinho Verde. Perhaps really the most important, the Monsello Melgaço, which is where they make 100% varietal Alvarinho and sparkling, what they name as Alvarinho here. These share the same geographical boundaries. It's a cool, rainy climate that's influenced, of course, by the Atlantic Ocean. The off-ground trellising system, once common, called enforcado, about less than 10% of the vines are planted in this way today. At the time, it provided an opportunity to get airflow. It also gave them the chance to plant other crops underneath their grapevines. It's the largest DOP. It accounts for 15% of all of Portugal's vineyard acreage. You find primarily granitic slopes. The Vinho Verde DOC, there are 9 subzones. We mentioned Monsello Melgaço. These are, again, varietal Alvarinho. Your minimum alcohol for still whites here is 8%, 10 for sparkling, and 14 for vintage or Vendemmia tardiva, with 45 grams of residual sugar. Minimum alcohol jumps up for the Alvarinhos and Monsello Melgaço to 11.5%. And then Luero is the most planted white alongside Treixadura, Abeso, Paderna, and of course Alvarinho. You also see Vinho Verde reds. These are made from Vinho, Espadero, Boreal, Alvaral, and Amaral. So you see a lot more indigenous varieties throughout Portugal. We don't see as many international varieties here. Transmontano, which this is further inland, has 3 subzones, Chaves, Valpacos, and Planalto Mirandes, and they're shown here. Produces mainly dry reds in a hot climate, but there are some sparkling that exist at higher altitudes. It does have some of its own sparkling aging terms. Reserva here requires 12 to 24 months of aging prior to disgorgement. Extra Reserva steps up to 24 to 36 months. And Reserva Velha or Grande Reserva is 3 years aging prior to disgorgement. You see a lot more schist and granite soils as we start to get closer to the Duriense here. The Douro and Porto were once included in this region prior to the creation of that Duriense IGP. Here's the Duriense. Of course, the most important things that come out of this area are port. It's a hot continental climate. They get really hot summers and very cold, sub-freezing winters. You have to keep in mind the Marau and Montemuro mountains create the Douro Valley, of which the Douro splits. Of course, there are those 3 sub-regions that we know for port. Baixa Corgo in the west with a high density of plantings. Cima Corgo in the central, the most land under vine. And then the Douro Superior is eastern and therefore the driest and the warmest, producing all styles of wine. You can make red, white, rosé. For still, you can make sparkling, of course, fortified wines too. And those include Moscatel de Douro, which is made from the Moscatel Gallego grape and has to reach a minimum 16.5%. For reds, your sort of usual suspects, Touriga Nacional, Aragonés, so on and so forth. For whites, you'll find Malvasia Fina, Rabigato, Villacinho, and Gouveio. There is a 1% higher requirement for Reserva wines here than anywhere else. They score exceptionally well with the tasting panel. They qualify for the Grand Reserva title. You'll find a lot of schist soils throughout. Important to note, the first truly dry red wine of the Douro Valley is Casa FERREIRINHA's Barca Velha. It was established in 1952, some 56 years after the death of Dona Antonia, who of the Ferreira Port House always wanted to produce dry red wines and had the largest collection of port from all sorts of different vineyard sites in all of Portugal. The wines come from Quinta de Leda. There are 19 vintages that were released since its inception, and there have only been 3 winemakers. The original winemaker up until 1998, there was a little stopgap from 98 to 03, and then the current winemaker, Luis Sotomayor, who learned from the original winemaker, took over in 2003. Vintages in which it's been produced in the 50s, 52, 54, 57, the 60s, 64, 65, 66. 1970s, they produced 1 vintage. 1978, you can see the 4 in the 80s, 3 in the 90s, and the 3 in the 2000s. 2008 is current vintage. These are highly sought after, rare, and fantastically delicious wines. Next, we take a look at the Beiras. Here you'll find your 3 TERRAS, and then, of course, Beira Atlântico, which is the one coastal area. This was one IGP until 2011 when they split. In Terras de Dão, you'll find 2, the Dão and the Leifos, and Terras de Sister, named for the Cistercian monks. You'll find 1, the Tavara Barossa DOP, which is the center of sparkling production. It is traditional method. Terras de Beira, which is the Beira interior, has 3 subzones: Beira Castelao Rodrigo, Cova de Beira, and Pinhel. Here you can also produce Tinto Palhete, which is from blending up to 15% white grapes into your red. And then Beira Atlântico, which is the coastal region of this, which houses the Beirada DOP. This is home of the Baga grape, which has to make up 50% of the Tinto wines of the region. Your best producer here is Louis Pato. João Pato was the first winemaker in the region and began bottling in 1970 after his family had grown wines in the region since the 18th century. 1980 was Louis' first vintage. 1985, he began destemming and utilizing new French oak. In 1988, he plants ungrafted Baga and begins Vinhas Velhas label to understand pre-phylloxera grapevines. And then in 1999, he left the DOP and began to label simply as regional Beiras. As far as Terras do Dow, Dow itself has subzones. There's a handful right here. I'll let you take a look at them. They produce both Branco and Tinto wines, but they could be labeled in addition as Nobre, Reserva, and or Garrafira and Rosado. We'll take a look at those a little more in depth in just a second. For Tinto, 85% combined Touriga Nacional with a minimum of 15%, with Alfraquiro, Araganesh, Jaén, and Rufete. Brancos are Incruzado, Bical, Cercial, Malvasia Fina, and Verdelo. They also produce a Novo Tinto in its Nouveau style. The other DOP of the region, not nearly as famous as Lefos. Here your Branco, is Arinto based, and your Tinto is Amaral based. And these are a little bit more Vino Verde than they are Dow style. But we did take a look at the labeling requirements for the Dow. We can split it into Tinto and into Branco. There's a big page on Guildsom. It's a fantastic resource, but it's so overwhelming with the amount of information that's on it that I wanted to break it down into 4 distinct areas to help us memorize them. So we start with Tinto, and then we're going to move to Tinto Nobre, and then we'll do Branco, and then Branco Nobre separately. And within each of those, you've got Normale, so to speak, Reserva, and Garrafira. So for Tinto, Normale is 11% ABV minimum. When you step up to Reserva, you get 11.5% and 24 months aged. When you step up beyond Reserva to Tinto Garrafira, you stick with 11.5% ABV, but you move to a longer period of aging, 36 months, with 12 required in the bottle. For Nobre, your ABV ticks up to 12% with 36 months aging for Tinto Nobre. Tinto Nobre Reserva, a half tick up in ABV and 6 more months of aging to 42 months. Tinto Nobre Garrafira is 12.5% ABV with 4 years aging and 18 months in bottle. Branco Normale is 11%. Branco Reserva 11.5 with 6 months aging. Branco Garrafira also 11.5, but now we step to 12 months aging and 6 in bottle. And then your Nobre Branco wines have a minimum ABV for Normale of 12% with 12 months aging. Branco Nobre Reserva 12.5%, step up in that ABV with still 12 months of aging. And then Branco Nobre Garrafira, 12.5% ABV, 18 months aging, 9 in the bottle. Hopefully that helps break that down a little bit. You don't see a ton of those wines in the market per se, but I think it's always a question that sort of gets tossed around by people. The Lisboa IGP, formerly known as Estremadura, contains 9 DOPs. There's a ton. Perhaps the most important, though, we'll point out as we move forward. Alenquer, white and red from Arinto and Araganesh, same kind of thing with Aruda. Bucelas is dry white from Arinto and sparkling. There's no red wines produced there. Carcavelos, known for their reds, whites, but also for their fortified wines. This is sort of dying, though, from the urban sprawl of Lisbon. Colares is perhaps the most important. The whites here are Malvasia, 6 months in wood. And then your reds have 2 distinct soil types that help break them down. The Chal de Araya, which is sandy soils that primarily home to the Ramisco grape. And the Chal Regia, which is a harder soil type, which is primarily Castelao, or that Periquita grape that we mentioned as being one of the more widely planted in the country. Both of those require 18 months in wood with 6 in bottle of aging. In Costas de Aire has 2 subzones, Orem and Alcobaça. They also produce Medieval de Orem, which is 80% Fernando Pires and 20% Chicadera. Borinha only produces aguardiente, or brandy, with a minimum of 2 years of aging. Your Torres Vedras moves back to the whites and reds, Arinto and Araganesh, and then Obidos is white, red, rosé, and sparkling. So I think really the most important things to take from here is that Carcavelos produces fortified wines, the style of Vinho or port. Colares should be known for Ramisco and Castelao. And Costas de Aire has your Medieval de Orem, and Borinha is aguardiente only. The rest of them pretty much make Arinto and Araganesh. The peninsula of Setúbal, as we look further right here on this little peninsula, you can see where Lisboa was. We looked at some of those sub-regions. Here's Bairrada within the Beiras Atlântico, of course, Dow, more central. Now we're getting further south. There's two DOPs, very highly Mediterranean climate here. Your SETUBAL DOP is white, red, and varietal styles, and they're all Ligoroso. Muscatel de SETUBAL, which is made from Muscat of Alexandria, is labeled like tawny, vintage or you can label it as 10, 20, 30, 40 plus years. Superior means 5 years of aging. That was brought on by Jose Maria de Fonseca. And then your minimum sugar levels, if it's under 20 years, 280 grams per liter. Excuse me, that's must level. And then 20 plus years, 340 grams per liter. We also got the Palmella DOP here. They produce white, red, rosé, sparkling, and Ligoroso. Two distinct soil types here, limestone in the Arabida Hills, and then sand in the Palmella Plains. This is originally delimited in 1907 as second quality to Porto. It was renamed in 2009. The reds of Palmella are Castelao, whites Alvarinho, Fernão, Pires, and Orinto. You'll also find the Troia Peninsula. It's just across the way here. It's Portugal's largest fish market. And then to the east, you'll find the Serra de Arabida. Here's the castle of Palmella. This was originally a Moorish stronghold, and it sits at about 1,200 meters above sea level. It's pretty distinct and high level considering how close to the ocean you are. Next, we take a look at the Tejo and the ALENTEJO. These are named for the Tagus or Tejo River. Tejo IGP has a single broad DOP and it is Do Tejo. There's 6 subzones to it. You can take a look at them here. Mostly bulk and co-op production now. And then ALENTEJO has 1 DOP, also known as ALENTEJO. There's 8 subzones here. They produce white, red, rosé, sparkling, and also fortified styles. Trincadero would be the most planted. And you'll also find a lot of Quercus suber, which is cork trees. Algarve, right on the southern tip of the coast, has 4 DOPs. These are all dominated by co-ops. Reds are mainly Castelao and Tinto Negro Mole, and your whites are Orinto and Syria. These DOPs are Lagoa, Lagos, Portimao, and Tavira. The Azores Islands, we mentioned, being 972 miles due west of Lisbon, has 3 DOPs. Biscoitos is on the island of Terceira, famous for its fortified whites, although it does produce red, white, and sparkling. Graciosa, on its own eponymous island, makes white, sparkling, and fortified. And then Picos, perhaps the most important, another eponymous island for their fortified wines, is home to the Pico volcano. That's the highest point in all of Portugal. That's my show for today. That's what I have for breaking down dry Portuguese wines as best that I can for you all. You don't see a ton of them in the market, but the ones that we do see are delicious. So I say, go out, get yourself some Vinho Verde, see what you can do about finding some Barca Velha or some Louis Pato Baga, and we'll see you next week. Cheers, gang.